So I would like to welcome all of you to the 35th in the series of Zoom lectures sponsored by Congregation KINS. As I think all of you know by now, our speakers focus on a STEM topic in correlation with Torah. We have once again expanded our geographic horizons. Our speaker today, Rabbi Noach Light, is presenting for the second time from Boca Raton, and his topic is medicine related. It is, to me, a fascinating topic. Are You My Mother? Exploring Halachic Implications of Surrogacy. Rabbi Light earned his smicha at the Chofetz Chaim Yeshiva in New York. He is a Maradasra of East Boca, Kahil, and Boca Raton, Florida, and serves as the director of the Halacha program for both Yeshivat Tiberis Torah in Boca and the Boca Raton Kollel. He is a sought-after speaker and has served multiple times as scholar in residence. Once he has his screen sharing set up, I'm going to turn this over to him. So you can go ahead and set your screen sharing.
Okay.
Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to interrupt. The speaker will be glad to take your questions. Okay, Rabbi Light.
Okay, thank you so much, Uncle Steve. It's indeed a pleasure to be back with everyone. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to learn some Torah together. The topic is obviously very broad and very deep. And we're only scratching the surface, but to explore some of the conversations that have taken place over the last few decades on this topic. It's something that many people do struggle with, different reasons why a couple may experience infertility. And Baruch Hashem, we're living in a time with incredible medical advancements that have been enabling families to have children and to thrive. And the question is just, what are the halachic issues? What are some of the concerns, and how do we navigate those waters? I'd like to start off, even though the main focus of the discussion today is more regarding surrogacy. I'd like to take a step back, though, and discuss the general issue of what's known as halachic infertility. I'm just curious, by show of hands, are we familiar with that expression, halachic infertility? Basically, either a couple can have problems conceiving because there's something that needs to be tweaked. There's something that's wrong with either the husband or the wife. Or sometimes everything is working beautifully. The only issue is that the wife's cycle is a very short cycle. So we know that one ovulates 14 days before they get their period. And if theoretically one has a short cycle of every 25 days, and that means they're ovulating 14 days before then, it could work out that Lel Mikvah will not take place until after ovulation. So that window of time where they have the potential for conception is going to be missed. That's called halachic infertility, where we're both feeling fine, we're both healthy, but because of the shorter cycle and the requirement of the 5 days of the flow and then 7 clean days, the Zayin Nikiyim, by the time they get to day 12, assuming she's able to get a hefsek on day 5, it might be already past the time of ovulation, and that's problematic. So there were tshuvas going back. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has a tshuva, and Rav Moshe has a tshuva on the subject of, is it possible to shave off a couple of those 7 clean days? We know that the only time you have to have Zayin Nikiyim is regarding someone who's in the status of a Zava Gedola. That we don't have nowadays. Officially, Min HaTorah, Nida does not require 7 clean days. Once a lady has her period, there's Tumas Nida that lasts for 7 days. And as soon as those 7 days are over, assuming that she's no longer bleeding, she goes to the mikveh and she could become tahora. So is there any way to potentially suggest if Zayin Nikiyim, the 7 clean days, is a din derabanan, maybe we could be makel with a few of those days to be able to have her go to the mikveh a few days earlier. However, both of Shlomo Zalman, Auerbach, and Ramosha Feinstein, based on different reasons, but they both come to the same conclusion, which is there's not really room to be makel with the 7 clean days. There is room, however, to be makel with the 5 days. Generally, there are 5 days of the flowing, it's called, and then 7 clean days. If there is a way to cut back on the 5 days and maybe shave off 2 days, so she could start the 7 clean days instead of on day 6 and day 4, that there's a lot more room to be makel with. Baruch Hashem, though, Bisman Hazeh, this issue has a fairly simple resolution, is that there's medication that could push off the period and therefore push off the ovulation. So assuming that the couple is able to conceive, that classic case of halachic infertility, Baruch Hashem, nowadays is more fixable. The case I'd like to focus on, though, is a situation where, and I'll give you 3 separate cases. They all get back to the same basic issue, and there might be different halachos in each case, but the same discussion. Case number 1 is, take a situation of a young couple where the wife becomes pregnant. However, she has a very difficult time in the pregnancy, and during pregnancy it results in dangerously elevated levels of blood pressure, high risk of heart failure, mortality, chas v'shalom, and she miscarries. 22 weeks into the pregnancy, she loses the baby. And the doctors tell her, it's not safe for you to carry a child. We saw what happened to you the first time, and we cannot guarantee you that trying this again in the future is going to be any different. So the young couple now has the consideration, if my eggs are fine and everything seems to be working okay, can we do an IVF procedure, taking the eggs from the mommy, taking the sperm from the tati, creating conception in the lab, and then having a gestational surrogate, having someone else choose to carry the baby for us? Is that okay? Is there any problem with that? And if we were to choose to do that, then the question comes down to, who is the halachic mother of the child? Is it based on the egg donor, or officially, genetically speaking, she is the mother of the child? Or is it based on the surrogate mother who is actually giving birth to the baby 9 months later? So that's case number 1. Case number 2, take a situation where, for whatever reason, either the wife was born with a condition, or perhaps maybe she had chemotherapy at some point down the road, and that damaged her ovaries. Her ovaries are not really functioning. However, Baruch Hashem, for modern technology, there is now the option of having an ovarian transplant, where theoretically we can implant into this lady a whole new system. So it's really coming from somebody else, but by doing this ovarian transplant, now she'll have the opportunity of conceiving. And if and when she does, the question again would be, do we say you're the mother because this all happened within you and you're the one carrying the child and giving birth to the child? Or do we say, listen, genetically speaking, because your ovaries came from somebody else, that other person is really halachically the mother? So that would be case number 2. Case number 3 is a situation where, let's say you have a couple, they've been struggling for years without children. They've tried multiple times with IVF, and that has been unsuccessful. Now the question is, maybe if she can get an egg from somebody else, maybe it's just the eggs that are not working well. She could have an ovum donation, and then using someone else's egg, she'll be able to carry the mother. She'll be able to carry the baby. So these are all cases that do happen. And ultimately, the shaila, the question from a halachic standpoint is, if A is the egg donor and B is the one carrying the child, who is the mother halachically? Or in a situation of the ovarian transplant, where it's not that you gave me the egg and now I'm carrying your egg, but I have your system, so to speak, within me. What is the halachic status of that situation as well? So I'd like to just go through some of the discussions that have been going on throughout the last 40, 50 years on the subject. Obviously not to come to any halacha l'maisa conclusions, that you should consult your local Orthodox rabbi. I remember when I was teaching in high school, one of the high school kids raised their hands, probably 10th grader, and he said something about asking your Lord. And I had no clue what he was talking about. So he explained, Lord is local Orthodox rabbi dude. That's so you could refer questions to your Lord. But to go through some of the interesting highlights on this journey, there's a Gemara in Chulin. This is the first source we have over here. We have a photocopy from the Art Scroll. The Gemara speaks about a case that seems very whimsical, that hidvik shnei rechamim v'yotze mizeh v'nichnas lezeh. You have a farmer who was really bored, so he tried to do an experiment with his animals. And what he did is he attached two wombs of different animals together. And what happened is that the fetus in animal A somehow jumped out of that rechem, jumped out of the womb, right into animal B. So the Gemara has the following question. Mahu, how do we view the halachic status of Bechor? We know that the Bechor, the firstborn, the Peter Rechem of an animal, has a special status. It seems clear that this little fetus that jumped out of the first animal is a Bechor from the first mother. Peter Rechem means that was the animal that opened up the womb. The question the Gemara has is, now that this fetus is inside mother number 2 or cow number 2, and it hangs out there for a while, and then that animal gives birth to this calf, does this calf count as a Peter Rechem for the second animal? Listen to the way the Gemara expresses the question. It says, Mahu, didei potter, lav didei lo potter. Do we say that the fetus can only pater, can only open up its own mother, meaning mother number 1, but it doesn't have the ability to create a Peter Rechem opening up the womb of mother number 2? O Dilma, the lavdi, de nami potter. Or can we suggest that even though it originated from the first animal, once somehow it made its way into the second animal, so then once it's delivered, once that animal gives birth to the calf, it should also be considered a Peter Rechem, a Bechor, a firstborn of the second animal? That's the Gemara's question, and the Gemara answers, when it happens, give me a call, right? Teku, we're not sure. What many have pointed out, though, based on the Lashonos, the language used in this Gemara, is the question is only, does the animal have the ability to pater the second animal, or only its own mother? The implication seems to be that its mother is animal number 1 or 2. What would you say? You're all muted. Implication is animal number 1 is the real mother, and the whole diyun, the whole question of the Gemara is, can it also work to be the Bechor of the second one? But its real mother is animal number 1. Perhaps we can glean the idea from this Gemara, although very, very whimsical, that the origin of this fetus, because it came from animal number one, although perhaps it developed more and it was ultimately brought into the world through animal number two, animal number one, its genetic mother is its real mother. That might be the implication from the Lashonos of this Gemara in Chulin. That's one interesting part of this discussion. There's another Gemara in Sota that speaks about the halacha of Arla. Arla, we know that fruit for the first 3 years of its growth, meaning the first 3 years of a tree's life, that fruit is not to be used. The Gemara in Sota, though, has an interesting question. Yalda shesivcha bezakena. If you have a yalda, which means it's a young tree, it's less than 3 years, so its fruit, they're not yet ready for consumption. However, you grafted that onto a zakena, onto a tree that's been around for many, many decades. The Gemara here says, Batla yalda bezakena. The young tree becomes nullified in the old tree. Ve'ein ba din arla, and there is no longer a status of arla on the young tree. This is an amazing Gemara, right? Picture the scenario. You plant a tree, a sapling in your backyard. It's now only 1.5 years. It has cute little fruit. Obviously, that fruit is arla. You cannot eat it. However, once you graft your young tree to a zakena, to an older tree, then the halacha is ein badin arla. The fruit of the young tree is no longer arla because it's bottle, it's nullified into the overall status of the older tree. If one was to make the application from this question of grafting trees regarding fruit to implanting mother A, her egg, into mother B, l'chora, we would have the opposite conclusion as the one we had from the Gemara in Chulin. This would seem to indicate that the ikar is where you're attached now, your continued growth. It's true I came from Arla, I came from a Yalda, but now that I'm attached to a Zakena, and I continue growing in this particular environment, there's an argument to be made that I am now bottled to you. In the case of the tree, the young branch is bottled to the older tree. Perhaps in the case of the egg is nullified into the body, into the system of the one carrying the child. Now, it's interesting when you look in the Shulchan Aruch, where it discusses this particular halacha of the Gemara in Sota, this in Yerodeus and in Reish Tzadi Daled, the Shulchan Aruch at the very end of Chaf Beis, right over here where the arrow is, the Mechaber Paskins, that Elon, this is the second to last line, Aval im hirkav anaf male pero shel arla. If you were to take a whole branch of a very young tree with fruit that are already arla, because they're growing from the tree's less than 3 years old, if you were to take that, bitoch ilan zaken, and to place it, to graft it onto an older tree, haperos shel anaf asurim laolam, those fruits are always going to be asur. Those fruits are always going to be asur. Afilu godlu harbe, even if they continue growing based on the nutrients that this branch is getting from the entire tree, those fruits are always going to be asur. The Shach, though, explains, this is the Shach that I have quoted right here, this is Shach Sivkat and Lamed Beis, one of the great commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. He says, Mashma, Ha gidulim atzman mutarin. The implication of the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch is only when you take the young tree that's only 1.5 years and it has its fruit that's already considered orla, by grafting that to the older tree, it doesn't lose its status. And even if they continue to grow more, those fruits will always remain orla. However, implication is that new fruits that grow from that branch, after it's already been grafted to the older tree, those new fruits would not have the status of orla. So we see here a very important distinction potentially that has ramifications regarding our question. One could argue that taking the egg from the egg donor and implanting that into the surrogate mother, right, the woman who's going to be carrying the child, maybe that's analogous to taking the branch with the fruit already there. And just like the fruit, even if they continue to grow, but it started off with the orla status and it keeps that orla status, potentially you could argue the same thing would be true with an egg. It starts off as the egg of mommy A, and now it's in mommy B, and it's going to continue to grow, and you have a little embryo that develops into a fetus, and then eventually it's a little baby. But perhaps that's just growing of the fruit where it always maintains its original status. In contrast to, right, the case that we mentioned of an ovarian transplant. An ovarian transplant, at least conceptually, you could argue that's like attaching the branch from the younger tree onto the older tree, and now it produces peros. That's part and parcel of the zakena of the older tree. Perhaps the same thing could be true with an ovarian transplant. There, everyone might agree that anything that's produced, the egg that's produced now that it's totally bottled, it's attached and part and parcel of mother number two, of course she would be considered the halachic mother. But regarding the transferring of an egg, that is not at all simple. So these are two of the many sources that have been quoted regarding this issue. One is the Gemara in Chulin, one fetus jumping out of cow number one to cow number two, and the other Gemara is the Gemara in Sota and Daf Mem Gimel, where it speaks about the grafting of a young tree with an older tree. And the truth is, and this is a very fascinating part of this whole journey, there are many sources that are quoted in the non-halachic sections of Gemara, right? The Agadata. And before we give an example of that, I'd like to share with you a very fundamental tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda. The Noda B'Yehuda is addressing the legitimacy or the permissibility of taking an Agadata, any piece in the Gemara or Chazal, that it's not really intended for halacha l'maisa, it's more a hashkafa or an insight into Tanakh, taking any source that's not intended for halacha and using it as a source to paskin. That's something that's not at all simple. We can take a look here together, the tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda. He writes, we'll just read some of the underlined pieces together. He's writing back to the person who addressed the question to him. I'm not sure why you have to have this whole lengthy discussion about how amazing the words of Chazal are. Of course they're amazing. This is Torah. V'chol divrei bali hatalmud kulam nitnu meroa echad. Everything we find in Shas, it all comes from that same source of truth. Ve'ein behem divrei riku batel. Nothing is meaningless. Nothing is empty. Ve'im reku me'itanuhu. And if we find or we can't find the reason or understanding behind a particular part of Chazal, it's based on the fact we don't have the ability, we don't have the Mesorah to decipher what's really happening. Ubavada, he says, of course, when a person has time, one has to not only spend effort exploring the halachic sections, but also divrei agada. He goes on to say, however, I myself, I only have the time to answer questions that are pertinent to halacha l'maisa. Because of my busy schedule, because of the burden of the tzibur that I have, I wish I had more time to explore Agada, but I have to limit my tshuva writing to those questions that are more directly halacha l'maisa. And he goes on to say as follows. He says that whenever we have an Agada, the reason why I don't feel comfortable extrapolating halacha l'maisa is because often we don't really know what the Agada is saying. We could always derive messages and musar and Torah hashkafa, but to think that we know precisely what Chazal are trying to tell us through the Agada to the point where we can make a halacha l'maisa application, that I don't feel comfortable doing. He writes here towards the end of this tshuva, Hamidrashim va'agados ikar kavanosan al hamusar v'al ha'ramazim. The intent of Chazal when they were composing the Agada is more for musar and to be merames, to allude to Torah ideals and values. V'ala mishalim shebehem v'hakol ikar hadas, and not to ever look down or to view it as less important as everything else. Aval ein ikar kavanasam al piske halachos, but their intent in creating the Agada was not to give us halacha l'maisa, and therefore ein lemedim mehem l'psak halacha klal. We cannot derive from Agada anything that's halacha l'maisa. This is the basic approach of the Noda B'Yehuda. Question though is, if you have a situation like surrogacy or an ovarian transplant, things that are not at all explicit in the Gemara, maybe in that situation, although we might have a potential proof from the Gemara in Chulin, and we have a potential proof from the Gemara in Sota, nothing at all is compelling. Are you allowed to then look in Divrei Agada to get more clarity? So although the Noda B'Yehuda feels it's never a place to derive halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Kiva Eger was of the opinion that if there's nothing else that's clear in the other areas of Gemara, and you do find something that might be helpful even from an Agada section, potentially that can be used as a source for halacha. So I wanted to share with you one of the well-known sources that does come from Agada, but it is definitely spoken about relating to this shaila. This is the pasuk in Chumash where it speaks about the birth of Dinah. V'achar yalda bas v'tikra es shema Dinah. That Rachel gave birth to a girl, and she called her name Dinah. Vayizker Elokim es Rachel vayishma eleha. I'm sorry. Dinah was the daughter of Leah. Leah gave birth to a girl. Her name was Dinah. Then vayizker Elokim es Rachel. Right after that pasuk, it says Hashem remembered Rachel. Vayishma eleha Elokim, and Hashem listened to her. Vayiftach es rachma. And Hashem opened up her womb. V'taher v'teled ben, she conceived and she bore a son. V'tomer osef Elokim mes cherpasi. This was the birth of Yosef. So what's the meaning here, this juxtaposition between Leah giving birth to Dinah and then Rachel giving birth to Yosef? So take a look at the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel, where he basically quotes from Torah Shebal Peh. This is a tradition that we have that needs to be explored. He writes, what happened is that initially Leah was going to give birth to another boy, to a fifth boy, and Rachel was going to give birth to a girl. However, explains the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel in Pasuk Chaf Gimel. Sorry, this is the end of Chaf Aleph. He says that Salusa de Leah, that the prayer of Leah was that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be machlif urbaya b'meho, should switch the fetuses around to take the girl fetus from Rachel rather, and give it to Leah, and take the boy fetus from Leah and give it to Rachel. And that explains the juxtaposition that Leah gives birth to Dinah, Rachel gives birth to Yosef, because of the switcheroo that took place based on the tefillah, based on the prayer of Leah. And the Maharsha rather writes this. Maharsha says that Ha de nefcha Dinah lebas, this very cryptic expression that Dinah was transformed into a girl, Hainu, shehazocher shebebeten Leah, nitain bebeten Rachel. Somehow, obviously this is well beyond our understanding, but somehow through the tefillah of Leah, the male child that was in the womb of Leah, nitain bebeten Rachel, was given into the womb of Rachel. V'hanekeva shebebeten Rachel, nitain bebeten Leah, and the little girl that was in Rachel was transferred to the womb of Leah. So if that's the case, what is the pasuk called Dinah? She's Dinah Bas. Is she Bas Rachel or is she Bas Leah? What is she referred to as? Dinah Bas Leah. So maybe you could argue, listen, even though she started out in the womb of Rachel and then somehow mystically she was transferred into the womb of Leah, but she's called Dinah Bas Leah because Leah was the mother that actually gave birth to her. Perhaps you can bring, I don't want to say a proof, but perhaps there's a remez here, there's an allusion to this idea that although your origin came from mother A, ultimately your real mother is the one who gives birth to you. Now the Noda B'Yehuda would look at this and say, you can't derive halacha from Agada, especially halachas like this that are so incredibly complex. But this particular source has also been part of the very elaborate conversation in this topic. There's a tshuva from the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer of Oldenburg, who was the great posek of Shaarei Tzedek in Eretz Yisrael and the prolific author, where he discusses this issue from a more halacha l'maisa standpoint. And he goes through some of the sources that we've been discussing. And he says as follows. Regarding an ovarian transplant, he feels then it's very reasonable to assume that although the ovaries came from a different person, once they're transplanted into the second woman, they become batal to the gufa isha. They are part and parcel of who she is. So in the analogy of taking the branch of a young tree and grafting it with an older tree, would say now it's grafted. Now it's all part of the zakena. That's all part of the older tree. However, he says that if the only way of having this ovarian transplant is by taking it from a different woman who is perfectly healthy, she doesn't want to have children anymore. She had a couple of kids and she's done for now, so she'd like to do a chesed. That's a different issue because that surgery itself is creating a case of serus. Doing any surgery that makes the first woman no longer able to conceive, that itself is problematic. However, if there's a way of doing an ovarian transplant, then he says, l'chulei alma, according to everybody, the child born from that mother would definitely be her child. What's more complicated is where, let's take the case we discussed. the mother can't carry the child, but her eggs are totally healthy and they're fine. And therefore she gives her egg to a surrogate mother. In this case, we don't have any clarity, although some poskim are more compelled in one direction and others in a different direction. Ultimately, there's no explicit source that tells us, is the egg donor the genetic mother, therefore the halachic mother? Or do we say once that egg is transferred to the surrogate mother, she's the one where the child's developing within her, she's the one giving birth to that child, and therefore she should be the halachic mother? Halacha l'maisa, in a case like that, who is the halachic mother, and what is this relevant to? So there are two main points that this has relevance. The first is if either the egg donor or the mother carrying the child, if one of those two are not Jewish, then the question is the child Jewish? All right, so if the egg donor is Jewish and the one carrying the child is not, then we really have to know who the halachic mother is to determine whether or not this child is Jewish. The other issue would be that it's of the utmost importance to know who your mother is, because that has many ramifications in regards to who am I, the child, allowed to marry. I'm not allowed to marry relatives, and therefore, does that mean the relatives of the egg donor or the relatives of the surrogate mother? Those are the two main areas of halacha l'lamaisa nafkamina that this has relevance to. Let's take a look here. This is a quote from the Nishmas Avram. Nishmas Avram was very, very close with many of the Gedolim in Eretz Yisrael. And this is from the English version of the Sefer that he himself translated from his own Hebrew Sefer, which is more elaborate. But he writes here that Rav Auerbach told me that although the great sages of Israel have discussed this problem, giving their theories, and even basing their opinions on Agadas Chazal, nevertheless, in his opinion, meaning in the opinion of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, there is no certain proof to the matter to enable one to decide whether the mother is the genetic mother or the surrogate. Nothing is clear. And although, in their opinion, the surrogate is the mother, meaning there were many Gedolei Yisrael that felt there's a stronger argument to be made that the mother carrying the child and giving birth to the child is the actual halachic mother, there's still room to wonder who would be considered the mother if it were possible to remove a naturally conceived fetus from a woman and transplant it into the surrogate. Thus, he thought that it would appear that in all instances concerning Torah law, one must act stringently. So what that means is, because we don't know for sure, in a situation where the egg donor is not Jewish and the surrogate mother is, or vice versa, because we're not 100% convinced that the one giving birth to the child is the halachic mother, and therefore theoretically the child may not be Jewish, we do a gerus misafik. We perform a conversion based on the doubt as to whether or not she really is or he really is Jewish. That seems to be the halacha l'maisa maskana of many poskim. But just to see some of the discussions here, what we did today was just literally the tip of the iceberg. There are volumes and volumes on this, and a lot more to explore.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Okay. I wanted to mention something. As most of you know, our son Phil is a Moyle, and he ran into a very interesting case relatively recently where two gay Jewish men wanted to become a father. And so one of them donated sperm, and they actually got an egg from a Jewish woman, fertilized the egg with the sperm, and then a surrogate carried that baby to term. And the question came up, is who is the mother? Is it the surrogate or is it the egg donor? Who is it? And that's sort of similar to one of the cases that you mentioned. But Phil asked someone here in Chicago, and I think the answer was that the surrogate would be the mother and not the egg donor. So, an interesting situation.
Definitely interesting stuff. One thing we do see is that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us, "Hafach ba v'hafach ba dekule ba." Everything is in the Torah. It's amazing how the Gedolei Yisrael had the ability and the mastery to be able to decipher, even things that were never even a dream hundreds of years ago.
Okay, anyone have any question? If not, Rabbi Light, if you'd be kind enough to disable your screen share, I want to just mention one more quick thing. That is for the next 7 weeks, because I have a teaching conflict, we're going to be switching from Tuesdays to Mondays for the next 7 weeks. And what's coming up next week on June the 14th, that's Monday, is another of our nephews from Boca Raton, Rabbi Shimon Feder, is going to be speaking on living a balanced life. And following that on June the 21st, Dr. William Gewirtz, he is a PhD in mathematical logic. I had no idea there was such a thing, but I guess there is. And he's making a presentation on the international dateline, and his topic is a dateline a logical necessity, a halachic view? So there are all kinds of interesting things about the dateline, so I'm looking forward to hearing that one also. So thank you again very much for your presentation today, for all the preparative time. We really do appreciate it. And since no one has any questions, then we will see you next week at 12 o'clock. So thank you all for attending.